A billionaire with a flawless empire crosses paths with a homeless woman scavenging in the shadows. When she returns his lost wallet, her unexpected honesty leaves him intrigued. But when he impulsively takes her into his lavish world, the cracks in his perfect life begin to show. A single locket, a buried hospital record. Pieces of a past he thought he'd left behind start falling into place. Who is this woman? What secrets does she carry? And how will the truth about their connection change his life forever? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. The glass and steel tower stretched into the dark evening sky like a gleaming monument to success. On the top floor, William Moore stood at his floor-to-ceiling window, watching the city lights flicker to life. His reflection stared back at him. Perfectly pressed suit, not a hair out of place. Everything about him was calculated, controlled, just the way he liked it. His office matched his personality, minimalist, cold, and impossibly tidy. The only personal touch was a small crystal paperweight on his mahogany desk, a corporate award that meant nothing to him now. "Mr. Moore?" Mia Carter's gentle voice broke through his thoughts. His assistant stood in the doorway, tablet in hand, her professional demeanor masking her concern. "The Foundation press event is tomorrow morning. The media will expect you to speak about the new children's hospital wing." William didn't turn around. "Have marketing handle it. I'm sure they can find someone suitable to cut the ribbon." "Sir," Mia hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "The board feels it would mean more coming from you. After all, it was your father's last project before he died?" William's voice carried an edge of ice. "Yes, I'm well aware." He finally turned to face her, his expression unreadable. "My father spent more time planning hospital wings than he did with his own family. I suppose that was his legacy." Mia had worked for William long enough to recognize the pain beneath his sharp words. She'd witnessed the strained phone calls, the missed holidays, the way William buried himself in work just like his father had. "Your father was proud of you," she said softly. A bitter smile crossed William's face. "Was he? I wouldn't know. We hadn't spoken in years before he died." He gathered his coat, effectively ending the conversation. "I'll be working from home tomorrow. Reschedule anything important." The elevator ride to the lobby was silent, matching the emptiness William felt inside. He knew his penthouse would be just as quiet, just as pristine. Sometimes the silence felt like it would suffocate him, but he'd learned to live with it. It was safer this way. As he stepped outside, the rain had started, a steady drizzle that turned the city streets into a blur of reflected lights. William was about to signal his driver when movement caught his eye. Near the service entrance of his building, an elderly woman in weathered clothes was carefully going through the dumpster. Something about her made him pause. She moved with a quiet dignity despite her circumstances, methodically sorting through the trash as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Her gray hair was neatly tied back, and even in the dim light he could see that her worn clothes were as clean as she could manage. Ruth, though William didn't know her name yet, pulled out what looked like a half-empty takeout container. She examined it carefully, her hands trembling slightly from the cold. There was no desperation in her movements, only a careful determination that spoke of years of survival. William found himself frozen in place, watching her. For a moment, a memory stirred, something about warm cookies and a gentle voice singing lullabies, but he pushed it away. Those fragments of memory belonged to another life, one he'd locked away long ago. "Sir?" His driver's voice snapped him back to the present. "Should I bring the car around?" William looked at his driver, then back at the woman. She had noticed them now and quickly stepped away from the dumpster, trying to make herself invisible. The simple dignity in her gesture struck him harder than any business negotiation ever had. "Just give me a moment," he said, surprising himself with the uncertainty in his voice. For the first time in years, William Moore felt something crack in his carefully constructed world of control and isolation. William took a few steps toward Ruth, his expensive leather shoes splashing in the puddles. The sight of her trying to fade into the shadows stirred something in him, an emotion he couldn't quite name. Before he could reach her, His foot caught on an uneven piece of sidewalk, and his wallet slipped unnoticed from his coat pocket, landing silently in a shallow puddle. Ruth watched the tall man in the expensive suit approach. His face was hard to read in the dim light, but there was something familiar about him that made her heart ache. As he passed by, his attention drawn to his ringing phone, she noticed the black leather wallet lying in the water. "Sir," she called out, her voice wavering but clear. When he didn't hear her over the rain, she picked up the wallet and hurried after him, her worn shoes squelching with each step. "Sir, please wait." William turned at the sound of her voice, surprise evident on his face. His driver tensed, but William held up a hand to stop him from intervening. "You dropped this," Ruth said, holding out the wallet. Water dripped from her sleeve and she shivered slightly in the cold rain. Despite her circumstances, she stood straight, meeting his eyes with quiet dignity. William stared at the wallet, then at Ruth. He hadn't even realized it was missing. Opening it, he found everything intact: the credit cards, the cash, even the small photo of his father he kept tucked away but never looked at. "You could have kept this," he said softly, studying her face. "There's enough cash in here to keep you comfortable for months." Ruth shook her head, a gentle smile crossing her weathered features. "That wouldn't be right. Money that isn't earned honestly brings no peace." William reached into the wallet and pulled out several $100 bills. "Then let me reward your honesty. Please, take this at least." "No," Ruth said firmly, though her voice remained kind. "I don't want a reward for doing what's right. That's not why I returned it." The rain fell harder now, but neither of them moved. William found himself captivated by this woman who had nothing yet refused to take what most would consider easy money. There was a wisdom in her eyes that spoke of both hardship and hope. "You're soaking wet," he said, surprising himself with the concern in his voice. "At least let me give you a ride somewhere. To a shelter, perhaps?" Ruth hesitated, studying his face as if searching for something. "That's very kind of you, but—" "Please," William interrupted, the word feeling foreign on his tongue. He rarely said please to anyone these days. "It's the least I can do." After a moment's consideration, Ruth nodded. "Thank you. That would be helpful." William gestured to his driver, who opened the car door. As Ruth carefully settled into the plush leather seat, trying not to get it too wet, William found himself wondering about her story. Who was this woman who had so little yet carried herself with such dignity? Why did her presence stir forgotten memories? He slid into the seat across from her, noticing how she sat with her hands folded neatly in her lap, her posture straight despite her obvious exhaustion. The interior light caught her face, revealing kind eyes that seemed to hold both sorrow and an unshakable hope. "Where would you like to go?" William asked, his usual commanding tone softened by genuine curiosity. The elevator doors opened directly into William's penthouse, revealing a vast expanse of marble floors and floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a panoramic view of the city lights below. Ruth stepped hesitantly into the space, her worn shoes barely making a sound on the polished floor. "You really don't have to do this," she said softly, clutching her thin jacket around her shoulders. "The shelter would have been fine." William shook his head as he removed his wet coat. "It's pouring, and most shelters are full by this hour. I have more than enough space here." He gestured to the enormous living room. "Please make yourself comfortable." Ruth stood still, taking in her surroundings. The space was immaculate but felt unlived in, like a museum after hours. Everything was sleek, modern, and probably cost more than she'd ever earned in her life. Despite the luxury, there was a coldness to it that made her heart ache. "The guest room is this way," William said, leading her down a hallway. As they passed through the living room, Ruth's eyes caught something that made her freeze. On a side table, partially hidden behind a modern art sculpture, sat a silver-framed photograph. It showed a young boy, maybe 8 or 9, wearing a prep school uniform. His smile was hesitant, almost shy, so different from the confident businessman she'd met tonight. But Ruth would have known that face anywhere. Her hands began to tremble, and she quickly clasped them together to hide it. "Is something wrong?" William asked, noticing her pause. Ruth forced a smile, though her heart was racing. No, just... Admiring your home? It's very beautiful. She moved away from the photo, afraid her face might betray her emotions. William watched her curiously. There was something different about this woman, something that didn't fit with his preconceptions about homeless people. She carried herself with quiet dignity, and her eyes held an intelligence that spoke of education and refinement. "The bathroom is through there," he said, opening a door to reveal a spa-like space. "There are clean towels, and I'll have some clothes brought up for you to change into." "You're very kind," Ruth said, her voice slightly unsteady. Most people wouldn't do this for a stranger. William found himself uncomfortable with her gratitude. "It's nothing. I have more than enough space here." He paused, studying her face. "Why were you out there tonight? You seem different." Ruth's eyes met his, and for a moment William saw a depth of emotion that startled him. "Life doesn't always go as planned," she said simply. "Sometimes the choices we make to protect others end up costing us everything." There was something in her words that resonated with William, touching a part of him he usually kept carefully walled off. Before he could respond, his phone buzzed with an urgent message from his office. "Please make yourself at home," he said, already distracted by the message. "I need to handle this. We can talk more in the morning." As he walked away, Ruth stood in the hallway, her eyes drawn back to the photograph of young William. She reached out as if to touch the frame but pulled her hand back at the last moment. A single tear rolled down her cheek, which she quickly wiped away. The vastness of the penthouse suddenly felt overwhelming, filled with the weight of unspoken words and buried memories. Ruth took a deep breath, steadying herself. She had waited 20 years for this moment, but now that it was here, she wasn't sure if she was ready for what might come next. The morning sun streamed through the penthouse windows, casting long shadows across the pristine kitchen. Ruth stood at the counter, her borrowed clothes neat but clearly too big for her frame, carefully arranging fresh fruit on 2 plates. William emerged from his home office already dressed in an impeccable suit, his attention fixed on his phone. He stopped short at the sight of breakfast laid out on the kitchen island. "Nah, you didn't have to do this," he said, slipping his phone into his pocket. Ruth smiled warmly. "It's the least I could do to thank you for your kindness." She gestured to the spread of fresh fruit, toast, and coffee. "Your housekeeper was kind enough to let me use the kitchen when she arrived this morning." Before William could respond, the elevator doors opened, and Mia Carter strode in, her arms full of folders. She paused, taking in the domestic scene before her. "Good morning, Mr. Moore," she said, her professional tone tinged with curiosity. "I brought the foundation documents you requested." Her eyes moved to Ruth, who was quietly arranging napkins. "Mia, this is Ruth," William said, somewhat awkwardly. "She's a guest." Ruth extended her hand to Mia with a gentle smile. "It's lovely to meet you. Would you like some coffee?" Mia accepted both the handshake and the offer, studying Ruth with interest. There was something about this woman that seemed to soften the usual sharp edges of her boss's demeanor. As they settled around the kitchen island, Ruth poured coffee into delicate porcelain cups. "You know," she began, her voice soft but clear, "this reminds me of when I used to teach at a private school in Boston. Every morning, the faculty would gather for coffee before the students arrived." William looked up from his plate, surprised. "You were a teacher?" Ruth nodded, a shadow of sadness crossing her face. "For 15 years, English literature. I loved watching my students discover the power of stories, seeing themselves in characters who overcame impossible odds." She paused, stirring her coffee. "Life has a way of taking unexpected turns, though. Sometimes the hardest choices are the ones we make for love." William found himself leaning forward slightly, his usual morning rush forgotten. "What happened?" "I had to leave everything behind to protect someone I loved deeply," Ruth said, her eyes distant. "Sometimes the right choice feels like the wrong one for a very long time." Something in her words struck a chord in William. He thought of his own father, of years of strained silence and unspoken regrets. Mia watched the interaction with keen interest. "Mr. Moore," she interjected gently, Speaking of making a difference, the Foundation's new youth education initiative could use your personal input. Your experience could really shape the program's direction. William usually dismissed such suggestions, but this morning felt different. Ruth's presence had somehow created a crack in his carefully constructed walls. Perhaps, he said slowly, it's time I took a more active role. Ruth's eyes brightened. Education can change lives, she said. Sometimes all it takes is one person believing in someone's potential. The morning light had grown stronger, warming the kitchen and casting a gentle glow over the three of them. William found himself relaxing into the conversation, sharing occasional glances with Ruth that felt oddly familiar and comforting. Mia observed the subtle shift in her boss's demeanor. The man who usually rushed through breakfast meetings was now lingering over his coffee, actually listening as Ruth shared stories about her former students. There was something about Ruth's presence that seemed to fill an empty space none of them had fully recognized before. The afternoon light filtered through the tall windows of William's home library, casting warm patterns across the mahogany shelves. Ruth ran her fingers along the spines of leather-bound classics, breathing in the familiar scent of old books that reminded her of her teaching days. "This collection is remarkable," she said softly, pulling out a worn copy of Great Expectations. "These books have been well loved." William stood near his desk, watching her. "My father started the collection. It's one of the few things of his I kept." Ruth carefully replaced the book and moved to another shelf, her weathered canvas bag hanging from her shoulder. As she reached for another volume, the bag slipped from her grasp, spilling its meager contents across the polished floor. "Oh dear," she mumbled, quickly kneeling to gather her belongings. William stepped forward to help, but froze when his eyes caught sight of a yellowed paper that had skidded beneath his desk. He picked it up and his breath caught as he read the header. St. Mary's Hospital, birth record. The paper was old, its edges worn from frequent handling. Ruth's face paled when she saw what he held. I can explain," she whispered, her hands trembling as she clutched her bag. William looked at her, his expression a mix of confusion and concern. "Ruth, what is this? Why do you carry an old birth record?" She sank into a nearby leather armchair, her shoulders sagging under an invisible weight. "It's all I have left of him," she said, her voice barely audible. "My son." William sat across from her, still holding the document. The afternoon sun caught the tears gathering in Ruth's eyes. "I was young and in love," she began, twisting her hands in her lap. "His father came from a powerful family who didn't approve of me. When my husband died suddenly, his family..." She paused, drawing a shaky breath. "They gave me an impossible choice. They would make sure my baby had the best of everything: education, opportunities, security, but only if I disappeared completely from his life." William felt an unexpected tightness in his chest. "You gave him up?" "I gave him a chance at a better life," Ruth corrected gently, wiping away a tear. "But I never stopped looking for him. Every city I've lived in, every job I've taken, it's all been part of my search. That birth record, it's my only proof that he was mine, even if just for a moment." The library fell silent except for the ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. William studied Ruth's face, seeing the years of pain etched in every line. "Let me help you find him," he said suddenly, surprising himself with the offer. "I have resources, connections. We could hire private investigators, search records." Ruth's eyes widened, a complex mix of hope and fear crossing her face. "You would do that?" "Yes," William replied firmly, unaware that he was offering to help find himself. "Everyone deserves to know where they come from. And maybe..." He hesitated, thinking of his own complicated family history. "Maybe he's been looking for you too." Ruth pressed her hands to her mouth, overwhelmed by his offer. The irony of the moment was almost too much to bear, sitting across from her son, watching him offer to help find himself. But she couldn't tell him, not yet. The truth needed the right moment, and this wasn't it. "Thank you," she managed to say, her voice thick with emotion. Your kindness means more than you could know." William placed the birth record carefully on the table between them, unaware that his own birth date was printed on its faded surface. "We'll start tomorrow," he said decisively. "Together, we'll find him." The morning sun streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of William's office as he reviewed the quarterly reports. His concentration was broken by Mia's urgent knock on the door. "Mr. Moore, you need to see this," she said, her face tight with concern as she handed him her tablet. On the screen, Richard Langston stood before a crowd of reporters, his practiced smile gleaming. "Moore Industries claims to care about community development, but where has William Moore been these past 5 years? The Heritage Center his father built is falling apart. The children's programs are understaffed. Is this the legacy of a true philanthropist?" William's jaw clenched. The Heritage Center had been his father's pride and joy, a community hub that provided education and support for underprivileged families. He'd avoided it since his father's death, the memories too painful to face. "He's trying to damage our reputation," Mia said softly. "The press is already running with the story." "Let them," William replied, his voice cold. But beneath his stern exterior, doubt crept in. Was Langston right? Later that evening, William found Ruth in the penthouse kitchen, preparing a simple dinner. The smell of home cooking had become a comforting constant over the past few days. "Something's troubling you," Ruth observed, setting down her wooden spoon. Her gentle eyes reminded William of someone he couldn't quite place. He found himself telling her about Langston's attack in the Heritage Center. Ruth listened attentively, her weathered hands folded in her lap. "You know," she said carefully, "sometimes the things that hurt us most are the very things we need to face. That center, it's not just your father's legacy. It's yours too." William stared out the window at the city lights. "I haven't been there since the funeral." "Then maybe it's time," Ruth suggested. "Those children need someone to believe in them, just like someone once believed in you." From the doorway, Mia watched their interaction with growing curiosity. She'd noticed how Ruth seemed to know exactly what to say to William, how her words carried a weight that went beyond mere wisdom. There was something familiar about the way Ruth looked at him when he wasn't watching. Meanwhile, across town in his luxurious office, Richard Langston poured himself a scotch, satisfied with the day's events. "The press is eating it up," he told his assistant. "Moore's reputation will take a hit, and when the board meets next week." But back in the penthouse, something unexpected was happening. William found himself opening up to Ruth about his childhood memories of the Heritage Center. "Dad would take me there every Sunday," he said softly. "We'd read to the kids, play basketball in the gym. It was the only time he seemed real." Ruth's eyes glistened with unshed tears. "Those moments shape us more than we know," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Perhaps it's time to create new memories there." Mia, still observing from the doorway, pulled out her phone and began a quiet search. Something about Ruth's story didn't add up, and her protective instincts toward William had kicked in. As she typed in Ruth's name, she glanced up to see the older woman placing a gentle hand on William's shoulder, a gesture so maternal it made Mia pause. William looked up at Ruth, feeling an inexplicable sense of peace in her presence. "Would you come with me?" he asked. "To the Heritage Center?" "Of course," Ruth replied, her smile hiding the storm of emotions behind it. Every moment with her son was precious, even if he didn't know who she was. The morning light filtered through the windows of William's office as he sorted through a stack of documents. Ruth sat quietly in one of the leather chairs, her hands folded in her lap, watching him work. "Your father's charity meant a lot to people," she said softly, breaking the comfortable silence. "The Heritage Center changed lives." William's pen paused mid-signature. "How do you know about that?" "I've been around this city a long time," Ruth replied, her eyes gentle. "I remember when it opened, the celebration, the hope it brought to families who had nothing." William set down his pen, memories flooding back. "Dad spent every weekend there, even when he was sick." He trailed off, his jaw tightening. "Maybe it's worth seeing what's left," Ruth suggested carefully. "Sometimes the things we run from hold the answers we need." William stood and walked to the window, his reflection ghostly in the glass. I haven't been there since the funeral. I'll go with you, Ruth offered. If you'd like. An hour later, their car pulled up to a worn brick building in one of the city's struggling neighborhoods. Faded letters spelled out Heritage Center above the entrance. Paint peeled from the walls and weeds pushed through cracks in the concrete steps. William's chest tightened as he stepped out of the car. Ruth followed quietly, her presence somehow making it easier to walk through the front doors. Inside, the air was stale and heavy. Dust covered the trophy cases his father had proudly maintained. The basketball court's wooden floors were warped from water damage, and half the lights flickered weakly. Mr. Moore? A surprised voice called out. A young woman approached them, holding a sleeping toddler against her hip. I'm Clara Johnson. I didn't expect to see you here. William cleared his throat. I came to assess the situation. Clara's eyes brightened with hope. We've been trying to keep programs running, but it's been hard since your father passed. The after-school tutoring helps so many kids, but we're down to just 2 volunteers. Ruth watched as William's professional mask slipped slightly. Without this place, Clara continued, adjusting her sleeping child, I wouldn't be able to work. The free childcare means I can keep my job at the diner. My Tommy here. He's learning to read early because of the programs. William's eyes fixed on the sleeping boy, remembering countless afternoons spent in this very building. How many families use the center? We still help about 30 regularly, Clara said, but we used to serve over 100 before the budget cuts. Her voice wavered. Some days we can't even keep the heat on. Ruth stepped forward, placing a gentle hand on Clara's arm. You're doing important work here. William walked slowly through the building, taking in the peeling paint and broken equipment. In the library, where his father had taught him to read, most of the shelves stood empty. A single volunteer sat with 3 children, helping them sound out words from a tattered book. Your father believed every child deserved a chance, Ruth said quietly, coming to stand beside him. He saw potential in everyone. William turned to look at her, struck by the emotion in her voice. Before he could respond, Mia appeared in the doorway, tablet in hand. Sir, the board is asking about the quarterly projections, she said, then paused, taking in the scene. Her eyes lingered on Ruth's face, something like recognition flickering across her features. William looked back at Clara, still standing in the hallway with her sleeping son. The weight of his father's legacy pressed against his chest along with something else, something that felt surprisingly like responsibility. The city lights twinkled through the floor-to-ceiling windows of William's penthouse as he and Ruth sat at the dining table. The remains of their dinner, a simple meal Ruth had insisted on cooking, lay before them. The warm aroma of homemade pot roast still lingered in the air. William swirled the wine in his glass, his expression distant. You know, my father never actually sat down for dinner with me like this. He gave a short, humorless laugh. Unless it was to discuss my academic performance or critique my business plans. Ruth's hands tightened around her water glass, but she kept her voice gentle. That must have been difficult for a young boy. Everything was about excellence with him. William's shoulders tensed as memories surfaced. Second place wasn't an option. B+ grades weren't good enough. Even when I made valedictorian, he only asked why I hadn't taken more advanced courses. Ruth leaned forward slightly, her eyes soft with understanding. Sometimes parents push hard because they see potential in their children. They want the best, even if they show it in all the wrong ways. William stood abruptly, walking to the window. His reflection showed a tight jaw and furrowed brow. The best? He missed every baseball game, every school play. He even skipped my high school graduation because of a business meeting. His voice cracked slightly. The Heritage Center got more of his attention than I ever did. Ruth rose quietly and joined him at the window, careful to maintain a respectful distance. Yet you kept trying to make him proud. Until I stopped caring, William said bitterly, or convinced myself I had. Love is complicated, Ruth said softly, her own voice thick with emotion she struggled to control. Sometimes it gets buried under expectations and disappointments, but that doesn't mean it wasn't there. William turned to look at her, struck by the depth of understanding in her eyes. You sound like you're speaking from experience. Ruth's hand trembled as she tucked a strand of gray hair behind her ear. Life teaches us hard lessons about love, about how it can exist even when we can't show it the way we want to. She paused, gathering herself. Your father built that center to help children. That speaks of a heart that cared deeply. Maybe. William's voice softened. I found him there once, late at night, helping a kid with math homework. He didn't know I was watching. It was the only time I ever saw him smile like that. Ruth's eyes glistened in the dim light. Perhaps he didn't know how to bridge the gap between being a successful businessman and a father. Some people carry love so deeply, they forget how to let it show. William sank into one of the plush chairs, looking suddenly vulnerable. The last time I saw him before the cancer got bad, he tried to tell me something, about regrets, about wishes. He shook his head. I was too angry to listen. Ruth's heart ached with the need to reach out to comfort him, to tell him everything. Instead, she carefully sat in the chair opposite him. It's never too late to forgive, William. Not him, and not yourself. Why do you care so much? William asked quietly, studying her face. Ruth smiled gently, though her heart raced. Because everyone deserves to find peace with their past, to understand that love can exist even in imperfect circumstances. They sat in companionable silence as the city lights sparkled below, each lost in thoughts of love, loss, and the complicated bonds between parents and children. The morning news hit like a thunderbolt. William stood in his office staring at the television screen where Richard Langston's carefully crafted interview played out. The headline scrolling beneath read, More industries accused of exploiting charity for tax fraud. That snake, Mia Carter hissed, clutching her tablet where similar headlines blazed across multiple news sites. He's trying to connect the Heritage Center's shutdown to alleged tax fraud. The press is having a field day. William's hands clenched into fists as Richard's smooth voice filled the room. It's tragic when charitable foundations become mere tax shelters. The public deserves transparency about where their donations really go. We need to fight back, Mia urged, already typing furiously. I can have our PR team draft a statement, schedule a press conference within the hour. We can't let him control the narrative. William reached for his phone, but Ruth's quiet voice from the doorway made him pause. May I offer a different perspective? She stood there, looking small but steady in her simple dress, so out of place in the gleaming corporate office. Yet something in her calm presence made both William and Mia turn to listen. Richard Langston wants you to react in anger, Ruth said softly, moving into the room. He's counting on it. That's why he chose to attack through the Heritage Center. He knows it's personal. William's jaw tightened. So I should just let him destroy my reputation? No. Ruth shook her head. But instead of defending yourself, show them who you really are. The Heritage Center isn't just about tax write-offs, it's about helping people. Show them that. Mia frowned. The media wants blood, they won't care about feel-good stories. Won't they? Ruth asked. William, remember Clara Johnson, the single mother we met there? There must be hundreds of stories like hers. People whose lives were touched by that place. That's your real defense. William slowly sat down, his expression thoughtful. You're suggesting we turn this around, make it about the center's impact instead of the accusations? Yes, Ruth said warmly. Don't just deny his claims. Show people why they're absurd. Open the center's books. Share its history. Let people see the real work that was done there. And announce its reopening, Mia added suddenly, catching on, with a personal commitment to oversee its renewal. William looked between the two women, feeling the weight of the decision. Richard's voice still droned from the TV, spreading his poisonous insinuations, but it seemed less important now. The press conference, he said slowly, we'll hold it at the Heritage Center. Invite past beneficiaries to speak, show the reality behind the headlines. Mia nodded approvingly, but Ruth wasn't finished. And William, speak from your heart. Tell them about the night you saw your father helping that child with homework. Let them see the man behind the billionaire. William's eyes met Ruth's, finding strength in her unwavering faith in him. You're right. Fighting fire with fire isn't the answer. We'll show them something better. Truth and compassion. As Mia hurried off to make arrangements, William turned to Ruth. How do you do that? See straight to the heart of things? Ruth smiled gently. Life teaches us that the strongest response to hatred isn't more hatred. It's love. Richard Langston wants to tear things down. You have the power to build them up instead. William nodded slowly, feeling a calm certainty replace his earlier anger. Through Ruth's wisdom, he'd found not just a solution to the crisis, but a way to honor his father's legacy while creating something meaningful of his own. The city lights twinkled like distant stars through the penthouse windows as William paced restlessly in his study. Sleep eluded him, his mind still buzzing from the day's events and Ruth's remarkable insight during the crisis. He paused by his desk where Ruth's worn canvas bag sat forgotten after she'd helped him prepare for tomorrow's press conference. A manila envelope peeked out from the partially open bag, its edge worn and creased from frequent handling. William knew he shouldn't look, but something about Ruth's earlier reaction to his childhood photo nagged at him. His hand hesitated over the bag. This isn't right, he muttered to himself, but his fingers were already drawing out the envelope. The hospital letterhead caught his eye immediately. St. Mary's Medical Center, birth records. The paper inside was yellowed with age, its creases so deep they threatened to tear. William's eyes scanned the document, his breath catching as he read. The birth certificate dated back 40 years, recording the birth of a baby boy to a young mother named Ruth Collins. His hands trembled slightly as he read further. The father's name was listed as James Moore. William sank into his leather chair, the document suddenly feeling heavy in his hands. Ruth had mentioned a child she'd lost, but she'd never shared details. Now, looking at the proof in his hands, questions flooded his mind. Why hadn't she said more? Why was she here in his home keeping this secret? From down the hall he heard soft footsteps, Ruth's familiar tread as she moved about in her guest room. The sound made him quickly return the document to her bag, his heart pounding with guilt and confusion. Through the study's open door he caught a glimpse of Ruth passing by, her figure silhouetted against the hallway light. She paused as if sensing his presence, then continued on her way, likely heading to the kitchen for her nightly cup of tea. William watched her go, seeing her differently now. The way she carried herself, the gentle wisdom in her eyes, the familiar gesture of tucking her hair behind her ear, all of it took on new meaning. He noticed how she held herself slightly apart, maintaining an invisible barrier even as she helped him navigate his life's challenges. His fingers drummed against his desk as he considered confronting her directly tomorrow. The thought made his stomach twist. Their growing friendship had become precious to him, a rare, authentic connection in his world of surface-level relationships and business dealings. Through the wall he could hear the soft clink of a spoon against china, Ruth stirring her tea. The domestic sound somehow made the situation more painful. She was here, so close, yet maintaining this enormous secret between them. William stood and walked to the window, pressing his forehead against the cool glass. Below, the city stretched out, millions of lives intersecting in countless ways. How many other stories like this were out there? How many other secrets kept people apart who should be together? He made his decision. Tomorrow he would ask her directly. The truth might be difficult, but living with this uncertainty was worse. As he turned back to his desk, he noticed Ruth's shadow pass by his door again, returning to her room. This time he saw how she hugged herself slightly as she walked, as if carrying a weight too heavy to bear alone. The secret lay between them like an invisible wall, and William knew that tomorrow would either break it down or make it permanent. Either way, things couldn't continue as they were. The truth, whatever it might cost, had to come out. The morning sun streamed through the penthouse windows, casting long shadows across the pristine dining room. Ruth sat at the massive oak table, carefully spreading jam on her toast while William watched her from across the table, his coffee untouched. The weight of what he'd discovered the night before made the silence between them feel heavy and uncomfortable. Ruth glanced up, catching his intense gaze, and her hand trembled slightly as she set down her knife. "Ruth," William began, his voice softer than usual, "I need to ask you something." He paused, gathering his courage. "Last night, I saw the hospital record in your bag." The color drained from Ruth's face. Her fingers gripped the edge of the table, her knuckles turning white. You looked in my bag?" Her voice was barely a whisper. "I'm sorry," William said, genuine regret in his tone. "I know I shouldn't have, but I need to understand. You told me about a child you lost, but there's more to the story, isn't there?" Ruth's eyes filled with tears. She looked down at her half-eaten breakfast, no longer hungry. "Yes," she admitted quietly, "there's so much more." Just then, Mia Carter entered with a stack of papers, but seeing the tension in the room, she quickly backed away. "I'll come back later, Mr. Moore." "No, stay, Mia," William said, his eyes still fixed on Ruth. "Please, Ruth, tell me everything." Ruth took a shaky breath. "I was young when I married James. His family was wealthy, powerful, but they were also controlling." She dabbed at her eyes with her napkin. "When I got pregnant, I was so happy. But James, he changed. He became like his family. Cold, demanding." William leaned forward, his breakfast forgotten. "What happened?" "After my son was born, things got worse. James's family threatened me. They said I wasn't good enough, that I would ruin their reputation." Ruth's voice cracked. "They gave me a choice. Leave with nothing, or stay and watch them turn my baby into someone as cold and heartless as they were." And Mia, still standing by the door, pressed a hand to her mouth, her eyes wide with sympathy. "I couldn't let them destroy his soul," Ruth continued, her words coming faster now. "So I left, thinking I could find a way to come back for him. But they were too powerful. They blocked every attempt I made to contact him." She looked up at William, her eyes full of pain. "I've spent decades searching for my son, watching from a distance, trying to find a way to tell him the truth." William's throat felt tight. "All these years, you never stopped looking?" "Never," Ruth whispered. "I lived on the streets, worked odd jobs, anything to stay close to where I thought he might be. I just wanted him to know that I loved him, that I never wanted to leave him." William reached across the table, taking Ruth's trembling hand in his. "Let me help you find him," he offered, unaware of the irony in his words. "I have resources, connections. We can track him down." Ruth squeezed his hand, fresh tears spilling down her cheeks. The kindness in his offer broke her heart, knowing the truth that lay just beneath the surface. "You're very kind," she managed to say. "But finding him is only part of my fear. I'm afraid of what he'll think of me when he learns the truth." Mia quietly slipped out of the room, leaving them alone with the weight of Ruth's confession hanging in the air. The morning sun continued to brighten the room, but Ruth had never felt more vulnerable, sitting across from the son who didn't yet know who she was, offering to help find himself. The taxi wound through narrow streets lined with aging brownstones, their weathered facades telling stories of decades past. Ruth pressed her hand against the window, her breath fogging the glass as memories flooded back. William sat beside her, watching her reactions carefully. "It's changed so much," Ruth whispered, her voice trembling. "But somehow it's still the same." The cab stopped in front of a small corner store, its faded green awning fluttering in the spring breeze. Ruth's legs felt weak as she stepped onto the sidewalk, her eyes fixed on the store's entrance. "Mrs. Chen's shop," she said softly. "She was here back then. She used to give me day-old bread when times were tough." William placed a gentle hand on Ruth's shoulder. "Should we go in?" The bell above the door chimed as they entered. An elderly Asian woman looked up from behind the counter, her eyes narrowing as she studied Ruth's face. Suddenly, recognition dawned in her expression. "Ruth?" Mrs. Chen's voice cracked. "Ruth Collins? After all these years?" Ruth nodded, tears welling in her eyes. The two women embraced over the counter, while William stood back, watching the scene unfold. "I remember everything," Mrs. Chen said, holding Ruth's hands tightly. "You were so young, so scared. That beautiful baby boy of yours." She glanced at William, not realizing the connection. "You used to come here every day, watching from across the street, hoping to catch a glimpse of him." Ruth wiped her eyes with the tissue William offered her. "Yes, until they moved away. Mrs. Chen, do you remember the locket?" The shopkeeper's face lit up. "Of course, the silver heart locket with the rose engraving. You saved for months to buy it. You left it with me to give to him on his 5th birthday." William's interest piqued. "A locket?" Mrs. Chen nodded eagerly. "Oh yes, it was very special. Ruth had a message engraved inside. 'My heart is always with you, my precious son.' I made sure his nanny received it, just as Ruth asked." Later that afternoon, William and Ruth sat in the dimly lit office of Marcus Drake, a private investigator known for his discretion. The detective's desk was cluttered with files and coffee-stained papers, but his sharp eyes missed nothing as he listened to their story. "A silver locket with a rose engraving," Drake repeated, making notes. "Given to a 5-year-old boy in this neighborhood approximately 35 years ago. That's something concrete we can work with." Ruth sat rigidly in her chair, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Every word brought her closer to the moment of truth, and fear clawed at her throat. "The family name was Moore," she added quietly, watching William from the corner of her eye. "James Moore's son." William's head snapped up, a flash of recognition crossing his face at his father's name, but he didn't make the connection yet. "Moore? But that's—" "A common enough name," Drake interrupted, typing into his computer. "But combined with the location and the locket, it gives us a good starting point." As Drake outlined his investigation plan, Ruth's mind wandered to the small box hidden in her bag back at William's penthouse. Inside lay a photograph of a silver locket, identical to the one she'd given her son all those years ago. The same locket that now sat in William's desk drawer at home, though he'd long forgotten its origin. The truth was so close now, hanging between them like a delicate thread. Ruth's heart raced as she watched William lean forward, engrossed in Drake's explanation of his search methods. She wondered how much longer she could keep her secret, knowing that each new clue brought them closer to a revelation that would change everything. Marcus Drake spread several manila folders across William's polished mahogany desk, each one containing records from different orphanages across the city. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows through the floor-to-ceiling windows of William's office, highlighting the tension on Ruth's face as she sat rigid in her chair. "I've narrowed it down to these 5 institutions," Drake explained, his weathered hands gesturing to the folders. "Based on the timeline and the family connections you mentioned, these were the most likely places where the Moore family might have placed a child." William leaned forward, his usual stern expression softened by concern. He'd cleared his entire afternoon schedule for this meeting, something he'd never done before. "What exactly did you find?" Drake pulled out a document from the first folder. St. Mary's Home for Children shows a record of a young boy admitted in the same month and year that matches Mrs. Collins's story. The interesting part is that the admission was handled by a private law firm, the same firm that your father used to work with, Mr. Moore. Ruth's hands trembled as she reached for the document. Her eyes scanned the yellowed paper, and tears began to well up. "This could be him," she whispered. "The dates match perfectly." William watched Ruth's reaction, feeling an unfamiliar ache in his chest. Over the past weeks, her presence had awakened something in him, a capacity for empathy he'd thought long buried. "What about the other locations?" he asked Drake, his voice gentler than usual. "Sacred Heart Orphanage and Hope Haven both have similar records," Drake continued, opening more folders. "But there's something else." He pulled out an old newspaper clipping. "I found this article about a wealthy family adopting a boy during that same period. The names were kept confidential, but the details align with what we know." Ruth pressed her hand to her mouth, suppressing a sob. William instinctively moved closer to her, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. The gesture surprised even him. Physical comfort wasn't something he usually offered. "I know this is difficult," William said softly, but we're getting closer to finding him. I promise you, we won't stop until we do." Ruth looked up at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and fear. What if he doesn't want to know me? What if he's angry about the past?" William squeezed her shoulder gently. "Any son would be fortunate to know a mother who never stopped looking for him. Your courage in searching for him all these years, it's remarkable." Drake cleared his throat, drawing their attention back to the documents. "There's more to follow up on. These records mention a silver locket, the same one you told me about, Mrs. Collins. It was listed among the child's personal effects." Ruth's fingers unconsciously went to her neck, where a similar locket might have hung years ago. William noticed the gesture, and something stirred in his memory, but he couldn't quite place it. "I want to visit these places," William declared, his voice firm with determination. "We'll go to each one if we have to. Whatever resources you need, Mr. Drake, they're at your disposal." Ruth turned to William, her eyes wide with surprise. "You don't have to do all this. Your company, your responsibilities. This is more important," William replied, surprising himself with the conviction in his voice. The man he'd been just weeks ago would never have said such a thing. But Ruth's story, her unwavering love for her son, had awakened something in him, a desire to help, to connect, to make a difference in someone's life. Drake gathered the documents back into their folders. "I'll continue the investigation. Focus on these leads. We're getting closer, Mrs. Collins. The truth is within reach." The grand ballroom of the Renaissance Hotel sparkled with crystal chandeliers and elegant decorations. Hundreds of New York's elite mingled, their evening wear catching the light as they discussed William Moore's charitable foundation. At the center of it all stood William himself, looking sharp in his tailored tuxedo, actually engaging with guests, a noticeable change from his usual aloof demeanor. Ruth Collins watched from a quiet corner, wearing a simple but elegant navy dress that William had insisted on buying her for the occasion. Her eyes constantly scanned the room, not out of discomfort, but from a mother's instinct to protect. That's when she noticed Richard Langston huddled with a group of reporters near the bar, speaking in hushed tones with a calculating smile. Moving closer while pretending to admire a nearby ice sculpture, Ruth's heart dropped as she caught fragments of their conversation. "Tax records, shell companies, all a front," Richard was saying, sliding what looked like documents across the bar. "Moore's foundation is nothing but a tax haven. He's playing everyone for fools." Ruth's hands trembled as she watched the reporters scribbling notes. Without drawing attention to herself, she made her way through the crowd to where William stood talking with potential donors. "William," she whispered, touching his elbow gently, "I need to speak with you. It's urgent." William noticed the concern in her eyes immediately. "Excuse me," he said to the donors, following Ruth to a quiet alcove. "Richard Langston is spreading lies about the foundation," Ruth explained quickly. "He's telling reporters it's all a tax scheme. They're going to run the story tonight." William's jaw tightened, but instead of the cold fury that would have consumed him weeks ago, a calm determination settled over him. Ruth's presence had that effect, helping him see clearly through chaos. "Thank you for telling me," he said softly, squeezing her hand. The gesture was automatic now, natural in a way that surprised him. "Stay here. I'll handle this." William strode purposefully across the ballroom, Mia Carter falling into step beside him as if sensing the coming confrontation. They reached Richard just as he was finishing his conversation with the reporters. "Richard," William's voice cut through the ambient chatter, "I believe you have something to say about my foundation?" Richard's smile turned predatory. "William, just sharing some interesting findings with our friends from the press. The public deserves to know the truth, don't you think?" "The truth?" William's voice remained steady. "The truth is that every penny of foundation money goes to people who need it. Unlike some, I don't need to hide behind lies and manipulation." "Big words from someone who's never had to struggle," Richard sneered. "Yeah, you're right, I haven't struggled," William admitted, surprising everyone, including himself. but I'm learning what really matters thanks to people who have shown me true integrity." His eyes briefly found Ruth in the crowd. "If you want to examine records, let's do it properly," William continued. "Mia, please provide these reporters with full access to our foundation's books. Every transaction, every project, every beneficiary." He turned to the journalists. "I have nothing to hide. The question is, what would we find if we looked into Mr. Langston's dealings with the same scrutiny?" Richard's face reddened. "You're bluffing." "No, Richard, I'm standing up for what's right, something I should have done long ago." And the reporters had already turned their attention to William, sensing a better story than the one Richard had fed them. Mia stepped forward, already coordinating with them to arrange meetings with the Foundation's financial team. From her spot across the room, Ruth watched with pride as William handled the situation with grace and strength. When their eyes met briefly through the crowd, she saw not just the powerful businessman, but glimpses of the son she'd never stopped loving. The city lights twinkled through the floor-to-ceiling windows of William Moore's penthouse as evening settled over New York. Ruth Collins sat on the plush leather couch, her hands wrapped around a warm cup of chamomile tea. William had loosened his tie and rolled up his sleeves after their return from the gala, looking more relaxed than she'd ever seen him. "You handled Richard Langston beautifully tonight," Ruth said softly, her voice filled with maternal pride she couldn't quite hide. William settled into the armchair across from her, running a hand through his dark hair. "I learned from the best," he replied, offering her a rare smile. "You've taught me more about integrity in these few weeks than my father did in a lifetime." Ruth's hands tightened around her teacup. "William, there's something I need to tell you." She paused, gathering her courage. "I'm scared about finding my son." William leaned forward, his expression softening. "Why?" "Because—" Ruth's voice cracked slightly. "What if he hates me? What if he can't understand why I had to leave?" She placed her tea on the coffee table, her hands trembling. "I've imagined our reunion 1,000 times, but in my darkest moments I see him turning away from me, disgusted that I abandoned him." "I don't think he would," William said quietly. "Not if he knew the whole story." "How can you be so sure?" William stood up and walked to the window, his silhouette stark against the city lights. "Because I understand what it's like to feel unloved by a parent." He turned back to face her. "My father. He was always so cold, so distant. I used to think it was my fault that I wasn't good enough." Ruth's heart ached watching him struggle with the painful memories. "The only comfort I had as a child was this old locket," William continued, absently touching his chest where something hung beneath his shirt. "I don't even remember where it came from, but it made me feel less alone somehow." Ruth's breath caught in her throat. Her hands began to shake more violently, and she clasped them together to steady them. The locket, the very one she'd given him the day she'd been forced to leave him at the orphanage. "I still have it," William said, pulling the chain from beneath his shirt. The silver was tarnished now, but Ruth would have recognized it anywhere. It was the exact same heart-shaped locket with a small dent on the right side where it had been dropped once. Ruth felt tears welling up in her eyes, but she forced them back. Her whole body screamed to tell him the truth, to reveal that she was his mother, but fear kept her silent. This brilliant, successful man had built an entire life without her. What right did she have to upend everything now? "Sometimes," William continued, lost in his own memories, "I'd make up stories about my real mother. I'd imagine she was kind and gentle, nothing like the cold woman who raised me. Silly, isn't it?" "Not silly at all," Ruth managed to whisper, her voice thick with emotion. "Every child deserves to feel loved." William returned to his seat, carefully tucking the locket back under his shirt. "That's why I don't think your son could hate you, Ruth. Whatever the reasons were, I can see in your eyes how much you love him. That kind of love, it counts for something." Ruth nodded, unable to speak. Her son was sitting right in front of her, sharing his pain, unknowingly seeking comfort from the very person who had caused it. The irony was almost too much to bear, but she maintained her composure though her heart was breaking all over again. The autumn breeze rustled through the construction tarps as William Moore and Ruth Collins walked through the partially renovated charity center. The old building was coming back to life, its worn facade now gleaming with fresh paint and new windows that caught the morning light. "It's remarkable what you've accomplished in just a few weeks," Ruth said, her eyes taking in the transformation. Workers moved purposefully around them, carrying materials and consulting blueprints. William nodded, his usual stern expression softened by a hint of pride. "The contractor says we're ahead of schedule. The new children's wing should be ready by next month." As they rounded a corner, an elderly woman in a volunteer's apron stopped dead in her tracks, her eyes fixed on Ruth. "Good heavens!" she exclaimed, pressing a hand to her chest. "Ruth? Ruth Collins? Is that really you?" Ruth froze, her face draining of color. William noticed her reaction and stepped closer protectively. The volunteer, her gray hair pulled back in a neat bun, hurried forward. "It is you. I'd recognize those kind eyes anywhere. You used to volunteer here. Oh, must be 35, 40 years ago now." William's attention snapped to Ruth, who seemed to shrink under his questioning gaze. "Martha," Ruth managed weakly, I didn't expect to see you here after all these years." Martha beamed, oblivious to the tension. "Oh, I never left. Someone had to keep this place going after—" She trailed off, glancing uncertainly at William. "After what?" William prompted, his voice carefully neutral. "Well, after Mr. Moore Sr. pulled the funding," Martha explained. "Such a shame, really. Ruth here was one of our most dedicated volunteers back then. Always here with her little boy, wasn't she? Such a sweet child." William's jaw tightened. He turned to Ruth, who was staring fixedly at the floor. "Your son?" he asked quietly. "You volunteered here with your son?" Ruth's hands twisted together nervously. "It was a long time ago, William." "Oh, she was so proud of that boy," Martha continued enthusiastically. "Always talking about him, showing everyone his pictures. Had his father's eyes, as I recall. Such a tragedy when—" "Martha," Ruth interrupted sharply, "perhaps you could show William the plans for the new kitchen? I'm sure he'd be interested in your input." William stood rooted to the spot, his mind racing. Something about the timeline nagged at him. The years matched up with his early childhood, before his father's family had taken him in. Fragments of memory flickered through his mind. Warm hands, a gentle voice, the smell of fresh bread in this very building. Mia Carter appeared from around the corner, clipboard in hand. She paused, sensing the charged atmosphere. "Mr. Moore, the contractors need your signature on some permits." William barely heard her. He was staring at Ruth, who seemed to be fighting to maintain her composure. "You worked here," he said slowly, "with your son, before you had to give him up." "William, please," Ruth whispered. "This isn't the time or place." "When exactly did you volunteer here, Ruth?" His voice was steady, but his hands had curled into fists at his sides. Martha looked between them, finally sensing the undercurrent of tension. "Oh dear, have I said something wrong?" "Not at all," Mia stepped in smoothly, taking Martha's arm. "Why don't we look at those kitchen plans while Mr. Moore handles the contractor paperwork?" As Mia led Martha away, William took a step closer to Ruth. "You're hiding something from me. Something about this place, about your past here." Ruth raised her eyes to meet his, and the pain he saw there made him catch his breath. "Some memories," she said softly, "are better left in the past, William. Please don't ask me anymore. Not yet." The afternoon sun cast long shadows across William Moore's office as he sat at his desk, turning the gold locket over and over in his hands. He'd found it in an old safety deposit box while searching through his father's belongings. A small, heart-shaped pendant with intricate engravings that seemed hauntingly familiar. His fingers traced the delicate pattern, and a memory stirred. Sitting on someone's lap, tiny hands playing with this same locket hanging from a chain. The scent of lavender, a soft voice humming. The door opened and Mia Carter entered with a stack of papers. She paused when she saw William's distracted expression. "Is everything all right, Mr. Moore?" "Mia," he said, not looking up from the locket, "do you remember what Ruth was wearing the day we met her?" "Of course, that worn blue coat and—" Mia's eyes widened slightly. "A gold locket. She never takes it off." William stood abruptly, gathering his coat. "Cancel my afternoon meetings." Back at the penthouse, William found Ruth in the library, reading quietly by the window. The same gold locket gleamed at her throat, catching the light. His heart began to pound. "Ruth," he said quietly, causing her to look up. "I need to ask you something." She marked her place in the book, setting it aside. "Of course, William." He approached slowly, holding out the locket from the safety deposit box. Ruth's face went pale, her hand automatically reaching for the identical pendant at her neck. "My father gave this to my mother," William said, his voice tight with controlled emotion. "I found it today. It's exactly like yours." Ruth's hands trembled slightly as she clasped her own locket. "Many lockets look similar, William." "Not like this." He opened the one in his hand, revealing an inscription inside. "This pattern is custom-made, one of a kind." His eyes locked onto hers. "Unless there were two made." Ruth stood shakily, moving toward the bookshelf as if seeking distance. "William, please." "The volunteer at the charity center recognized you. You worked there 40 years ago with your son." He took a step closer. "I have memories of that place, Ruth. Fragments. A woman with a locket just like this one." "Sometimes memories play tricks on us," Ruth whispered, but tears were gathering in her eyes. "Show me your locket," William demanded, his voice rough with suppressed emotion. Ruth's hand closed protectively around the pendant. "I can't." "Why not?" "Because—" She swallowed hard. "Because some truths are too painful, William. Some revelations can destroy everything." William ran a hand through his hair in frustration. "What are you hiding? First the hospital records, now this?" His voice rose slightly. "Every time I get close to understanding, you pull away. Why?" Ruth turned to face the window, her shoulders tense. "There are things in my past, decisions I made, that I can never forgive myself for. Please don't ask me to explain." "That's not good enough anymore." William's voice was firm but quiet. "Not with everything I've discovered." When Ruth remained silent, tears streaming down her face, William stepped back. "Fine. I'll find the answers myself." He strode from the library, pulling out his phone to call the private investigator. Behind him, Ruth sank into a chair, clutching her locket as quiet sobs shook her frame. In his study, William stared at the old locket, determination settling over his features. Too many coincidences, too many half-truths. Whatever Ruth was hiding, he would uncover it, even if it meant confronting a past he'd tried so hard to forget. The morning sun cast long shadows across the weathered brick of St. Mary's Orphanage as William Moore stood at its iron gates. The building looked smaller than he remembered, its red bricks faded by decades of weather. His driver waited in the car while the private investigator, James Porter, stood beside him. "This is where the trail led us, Mr. Moore," Porter said, checking his notes. "Records show a boy was brought here in 1983 matching the description we're looking for." William's throat tightened as fragments of memories stirred, running through these same halls, the sound of children's laughter echoing off the walls. He straightened his tie, a nervous habit, and walked up the worn stone steps. Inside, the orphanage smelled of floor polish and old wood. Sister Margaret, an elderly nun with kind eyes and silver hair, greeted them in her office. The room was cramped but neat, with filing cabinets lining the walls. "We're looking for information about a boy who was here in 1983, William explained, his voice carefully controlled. "He would have been wearing a gold locket." Sister Margaret's eyes lit up with recognition. "Oh, yes, I remember him, such a quiet child." She shuffled through some papers on her desk. "Unfortunately, many of our records from that period were lost in a flood some years ago, but I remember the locket clearly. It was quite distinctive." William leaned forward. Can you tell me anything else about him? He came from a wealthy family, that much we knew. His grandfather brought him here. Sister Margaret's forehead creased in concentration. The boy wouldn't let anyone touch the locket. Said his mother gave it to him. William's hand unconsciously went to his chest where the matching locket sat in his jacket pocket. The private investigator took careful notes while Sister Margaret continued sharing what little she remembered. Back at the penthouse, William paced in his study while Porter reviewed their findings. The timeline matches perfectly, Mr. Moore. The boy arrived at St. Mary's the same month your father claimed custody of you. Unknown to them, Ruth stood frozen in the hallway, having come to bring William his evening tea. Her hand trembled, causing the cup to rattle slightly against the saucer. And the locket? William's voice carried through the partially open door. Identical to the one you found in your father's safety deposit box, Porter confirmed. Mr. Moore, given all the evidence? Ruth couldn't bear to hear more. She set the tea tray on a nearby table and hurried to her room, tears already falling. Inside, she sank onto the bed, her whole body shaking with suppressed sobs. All these years of searching, of hoping, of praying. And here she was, living under the same roof as her son, watching him piece together the truth she'd been too afraid to reveal. The weight of her secret felt unbearable now. Ruth pulled out the locket she'd worn for 40 years, opening it to reveal the tiny photo inside. A smiling toddler with William's eyes, her son, her beautiful boy, who'd grown into this remarkable man despite everything he'd endured. She wiped her eyes with trembling hands and stood up, catching her reflection in the mirror. The time for hiding was over. Whatever the consequences, William deserved to know the truth. He deserved to understand why she'd left him, how desperately she'd searched for him, how much she'd loved him every single day they'd been apart. With shaking fingers, she unclasped the locket from her neck. This would be her proof. This and the matching pendant William had found. Taking a deep breath, Ruth squared her shoulders and walked toward the study, each step heavy with the weight of 40 years of secrets about to be revealed. Ruth's footsteps echoed in the quiet hallway as she approached William's study. Her heart pounded so hard she could barely breathe. Through the partially open door, she could see him standing by the window, his silhouette stark against the city lights below. "William?" Her voice trembled as she entered. "I need to tell you something." He turned, his expression guarded. The private investigator had left, leaving them alone in the dimly lit room. William's eyes fell to the locket clutched in Ruth's hand. "I heard you talking with Mr. Porter," she said softly. "About St. Mary's orphanage. About the locket." William's jaw tightened. "You've been eavesdropping." "No, Ruth took a shaky breath. "I was bringing your tea when I overheard. But William, there's something you need to know. Something I should have told you days ago." She stepped closer, holding out the locket. "This isn't just like the one you found, it's the matching piece." William stared at the golden pendant, his face growing pale. "What are you saying?" Tears spilled down Ruth's cheeks. "I'm your mother, William. The woman who gave you that locket all those years ago. That was me." The silence that followed was deafening. William took a step back, his eyes wide with disbelief and growing anger. "That's impossible. You've been living here, watching me search, and you never said anything." "I was afraid," Ruth whispered. "Your grandfather, your father's father. He threatened to destroy any chance you had at a good life if I didn't leave. He said he'd make sure you grew up in poverty, that you'd never have any opportunities." Her voice broke. "I thought I was protecting you." "Protecting me?" William's voice rose sharply. "By abandoning me? By letting me grow up thinking my mother didn't want me?" "No, that's not true." Ruth reached for him, but he pulled away. "I wanted you more than anything. I've spent every day since then searching for you. I worked at shelters, charity organizations, anywhere I thought I might find you." William ran his hands through his hair, pacing the room. "Why didn't you tell me when we first met? When you saw my picture? When I hired a private investigator to help find your son, who was me all along?" "I was a coward," Ruth admitted, her voice thick with emotion. Every day I spent here getting to know the wonderful man you've become, I grew more terrified of losing you again. I couldn't bear the thought of you hating me." "So you lied instead?" William's voice cracked. "Let me pour out my heart to you about growing up without a mother, while you sat there knowing the truth?" Ruth sank into a nearby chair, her shoulders shaking with sobs. "I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but please understand. Everything I did, every choice I made was out of love for you. Your grandfather was a powerful man. He would have followed through on his threats." "My grandfather?" William's voice was bitter. "The same man who helped raise me while you were gone?" "He made sure I could never find you," Ruth said quietly. "Changed your last name, moved you across the country. But I never stopped looking, William. Never stopped loving you. Every birthday, every Christmas I thought about you. Wondered if you were happy, if you were safe." William stood by the window again, his back to Ruth, his reflection showing the conflict on his face. "I used to make up stories about why you left," he said, his voice barely audible. "Told myself you must have had a good reason, that someday you'd come back and explain everything." "I'm here now," Ruth whispered. "I know it's too late, that." William sat alone in his office, the morning sun casting long shadows across his desk. The events of last night played over and over in his mind like a movie he couldn't stop. His mother, the woman he'd taken in from the streets, had been right there all along. The thought made his chest tight with a mix of anger and confusion. He pulled out the locket from his pocket, the one his father had given him years ago, the matching piece to Ruth's. His fingers traced the intricate pattern, and suddenly a memory surfaced. The smell of lavender, soft hands adjusting his collar, a gentle voice singing him to sleep. Had that been her? A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. Mia Carter entered, carrying a stack of papers that she set aside when she saw his troubled expression. "You look like you haven't slept," she said, sitting down across from him. "Ruth is my mother," William said flatly, watching Mia's eyes widen in surprise. "She told me last night." Mia took a moment to process this. "That actually explains a lot. The way she looked at your childhood photos, how she knew so much about your father's charity work." William stood abruptly, grabbing his coat. "I need some air." Mia followed him out of the building and across the street to Jefferson Park, where the morning joggers and dog walkers paid no attention to the billionaire in their midst. They found a quiet bench near the pond. "She abandoned me, Mia," William said, his voice rough with emotion. "Left me with my father and grandfather, never looked back." "Are you sure about that?" Mia asked gently. "Because from what I've seen of Ruth these past weeks, she doesn't strike me as someone who'd abandon anyone without a good reason." William stared at the water, watching a family of ducks glide past. "She said my grandfather threatened her. Said he'd make sure I grew up with nothing if she stayed. And knowing your grandfather's reputation, I believe it," Mia said. "William, think about it. Ruth has been living on the streets, working in shelters, trying to find you. She could have given up, started a new life somewhere else. But she didn't." A memory suddenly struck William, being 5 years old, standing in front of his grandfather's massive desk while the old man told him his mother hadn't wanted him. The pain of that moment had shaped his entire life. "She's been here this whole time," Mia continued, "watching you search for her son, for yourself, probably terrified of how you'd react when you found out. That takes incredible strength." William closed his eyes, remembering Ruth's face when she'd first seen his childhood photo, the way she'd turned away to hide her tears. How many times had she almost told him? How many moments had she struggled with the truth? "I grew up thinking she didn't want me," he said quietly. "But she spent her whole life looking for me, living on the streets, working in shelters, just to try to find me. Sometimes the people who love us most make the hardest choices," Mia said softly. "Your mother gave up everything, her comfort, her safety, her chance at happiness, just to protect your future." William looked down at the locket in his hand. Another memory surfaced, a woman's voice singing softly, "You are my sunshine, my only sunshine, He'd always assumed it was a nanny or a household staff member. But now, she's still here, Mia reminded him. Still waiting, still hoping. The question is, what are you going to do about it? William stood outside his penthouse door for several long moments, the key trembling slightly in his hand. Through the frosted glass, he could see Ruth's silhouette sitting on the couch, her head bowed. Taking a deep breath, he unlocked the door and stepped inside. Ruth looked up, her eyes red-rimmed from crying. She started to rise, but William gestured for her to stay seated. The space between them felt heavy with unspoken words. "I'm sorry," William said quietly, removing his coat. "I shouldn't have stormed out like that. It wasn't fair to you." Ruth's hands twisted in her lap. "You had every right to be angry, William. I should have told you sooner." William moved to sit in the armchair across from her, close enough to talk but maintaining a careful distance. "I need to understand everything," he said. "From the beginning. No more secrets." Ruth nodded, taking a shaky breath. "Your father, James, he wasn't always the cold man you knew. When we first met, he was kind, passionate about helping others. But his father, your grandfather, controlled everything, including who James could marry." She paused, reaching for the locket around her neck. "We married in secret. When I got pregnant, James was overjoyed. But your grandfather found out. Her voice cracked. "He threatened to disinherit James to make sure you grew up in poverty if I stayed. But if I left, he promised you would have every advantage in life." William's jaw tightened. "So you chose to leave?" "No," Ruth said firmly, meeting his eyes. "I chose to give you your best chance. It killed me, William. Every single day without you felt like dying." Tears spilled down her cheeks. "I got a job at the shelter, hoping to catch glimpses of you when your father's foundation held events there. I worked 3 jobs, tried to save enough money to fight for custody, but your grandfather's lawyers blocked every attempt." William leaned forward, his anger softening as he watched his mother relive her pain. "What happened after that?" "I lost everything," Ruth said simply. "My apartment, my jobs. Your grandfather made sure I couldn't stay employed anywhere respectable. But I couldn't leave the city, couldn't bear the thought of being far from you. So I lived in shelters, worked wherever I could, kept searching for ways to reach you." She wiped her eyes with trembling hands. "I was there at your high school graduation, standing at the back of the crowd, at your father's funeral too. Every time I saw you in the newspapers, I'd cut out the article." She reached for her worn bag, pulling out a plastic sleeve filled with yellowed newspaper clippings. "I watched you grow up from a distance, praying every day that you were happy, that you were loved." William took the sleeve, his throat tight as he flipped through decades of his life documented in his mother's careful collection. His first business success, charity events, awards. She had saved them all. "The hardest part wasn't being homeless or hungry," Ruth continued softly. "It was seeing you grow up believing I didn't want you. Knowing you were right there, but I couldn't hold you, couldn't tell you how much I loved you, couldn't explain." William's vision blurred as he looked at a particularly old clipping, his high school debate team victory. In the photo, he was smiling, holding up a trophy. "I remember this day," he said. "I looked for my parents in the audience. Father was too busy, of course, but I thought I felt someone watching me. That was you." Ruth nodded, unable to speak through her tears. William moved to sit beside her on the couch, the newspaper clippings cradled in his hands. Physical proof of a mother's love that had never wavered, never given up, even when all hope seemed lost. The grand ballroom of the Sterling Hotel buzzed with anticipation. Journalists filled the rows of chairs, their cameras and notepads at the ready. The backdrop behind the podium displayed the Moore Foundation's logo, elegant and understated against deep blue fabric. Mia Carter moved efficiently through the crowd, checking final details. She paused near the side entrance where Ruth Collins stood, nervously smoothing her simple but elegant navy dress, a gift from William. "Are you ready?" Mia asked gently, touching Ruth's arm. Ruth nodded, though her hands trembled. "I never imagined this day would come," she whispered. "All those years of hiding in shadows. The room fell silent as William Moore stepped up to the podium. He looked different today, his usual stern expression replaced by something softer, more vulnerable. His crisp suit and commanding presence still demanded attention, but there was a new warmth in his eyes. "Good morning," he began, his voice steady. "Many of you are here expecting an announcement about the Moore Foundation's new initiatives, and we will discuss those." He paused, his fingers gripping the podium's edges. "But first I want to share something personal." The reporters leaned forward, sensing a story beyond their expectations. 20 days ago, a homeless woman returned my dropped wallet outside my office building. This simple act of honesty led to a discovery that has transformed my life. William's voice grew thick with emotion. This woman who had lived on our city's streets for decades turned out to be my mother, Ruth Collins. A collective gasp rippled through the room. Camera shutters clicked rapidly as William gestured to the side entrance. Ruth stepped forward, her chin high despite her obvious nervousness. William extended his hand to her, helping her onto the stage. "My mother was forced to leave me as an infant by my grandfather's threats and manipulation," William continued, his arm protective around Ruth's shoulders. "While I grew up in privilege, she sacrificed everything trying to stay close to me, to protect me from afar. She worked at homeless shelters, took whatever jobs she could find, and never stopped searching for a way to reconnect with me." Ruth's eyes filled with tears as William spoke. Several journalists wiped their own eyes, their professional detachment crumbling under the weight of the moment. "The Moore Foundation has always focused on helping the underprivileged," William said. "But I never truly understood the depth of their struggles until I learned my own mother lived through them. Today, I'm announcing a new division of our foundation, dedicated to helping homeless parents reunite with their children, providing legal assistance, job training, and housing support." He turned to Ruth, his voice softening. "My mother's courage in returning that wallet, knowing it might lead to rejection, taught me more about integrity than all my years in business. Her unconditional love, which survived decades of hardship, showed me what true strength looks like." Ruth reached up to touch her son's cheek, a gesture so tender that several photographers lowered their cameras, feeling like intruders on this sacred moment. "The Moore Foundation's new initiatives will be guided by my mother's wisdom and experience," William announced. "She will serve as our special advisor, ensuring our programs truly address the needs of those we aim to help." The room erupted in applause. Journalists stood, many with tears streaming down their faces. In the front row, Mia Carter beamed, her own eyes glistening as she watched mother and son stand together. Decades of separation finally healed. Ruth stepped to the microphone, her voice soft but clear. "Thank you," she said simply, "for believing in second chances, for allowing love to overcome pride. And most of all," she looked up at William, "for being the kind of man who stops to help others even when you think they have nothing to offer in return." The applause grew louder, cameras flashing as William wrapped his arm around his mother, both of them finally whole, finally home. In his dimly lit office, Richard Langston paced back and forth, his expensive shoes clicking against the marble floor. The morning newspapers lay scattered across his desk, all featuring William Moore's emotional press conference on their front pages. His lips curled into a sneer as he read the headlines praising William's transparency and compassion. "This is perfect," Richard muttered to himself, reaching for his phone. "Moore's gone soft. Showing weakness in public? His shareholders won't stand for this emotional nonsense." Meanwhile, at Moore Enterprises, William sat reviewing documents with Mia Carter. The morning sun streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows, casting a warm glow over the office. "Sir," Mia said, her expression serious as she placed a folder on his desk. "Our investigation team found something interesting in Langston's quarterly reports. There are significant discrepancies in their overseas transactions." William leaned forward, his eyes scanning the documents. "These numbers don't add up," he noted, his business acumen kicking in. "Look at these shell companies in the Cayman Islands." Before they could dig deeper, William's phone buzzed with urgent messages. Richard Langston had called an emergency press conference, claiming that William's recent emotional display showed his inability to lead effectively. "He's trying to spook our investors," Mia said, her jaw tightening. But he doesn't realize we've got something much bigger on him. William stood up, straightening his tie. Get our legal team in here, and call Marcus at the Securities and Exchange Commission. He needs to see these documents. Over the next few hours, while Richard Langston smugly addressed reporters about William's compromised judgment, Mia and William worked methodically. They compiled evidence of Richard's illegal offshore accounts, tax evasion, and fraudulent reporting. The irony, William said, shaking his head. He thought my newfound humanity was weakness, but it's given me clarity I never had before. The old me might have used this information for private gain or revenge. Mia nodded, understanding the transformation she'd witnessed in her boss. What's your plan? We do this right, William replied. Through proper channels, transparently. No backroom deals, no private threats. That's the old way, Richard's way. Within hours, William's team had presented their findings to the SEC. The evidence was irrefutable. As federal agents arrived at Langston's headquarters, William called his own press conference. Standing at the podium, William spoke with measured confidence. Today, we've uncovered significant financial irregularities at Langston Enterprises. All evidence has been turned over to the proper authorities. He paused, making eye contact with the reporters. This isn't about corporate rivalry. It's about doing what's right. My recent personal journey has taught me that true leadership isn't about power. It's about responsibility. Across town, Richard Langston watched the broadcast in disbelief as federal agents combed through his offices. His face grew pale as William detailed the evidence against him, realizing his attempt to exploit William's vulnerability had led to his own downfall. Back in William's office, Mia brought in the evening papers. The shareholders are responding positively, she reported. They're saying your handling of this situation shows exactly why you're fit to lead, because you chose integrity over revenge. William smiled, picking up a framed photo of himself and Ruth from his desk. You know, Mia, for years I thought being cold and calculating made me a better businessman. But finding my mother, understanding her sacrifice, it's shown me that true strength comes from somewhere deeper. The phone lines were lighting up with calls from board members and investors, all expressing their support for William's leadership. Richard Langston's attempt to weaponize William's emotional growth had backfired spectacularly, leading to his own company's collapse and pending criminal charges. The autumn sun cast a warm glow over the newly renovated charity center. Where peeling paint and broken windows had once greeted visitors, fresh cream-colored walls and gleaming glass now welcomed families in need. William Moore stood beside his mother, Ruth Collins, taking in the transformation of his father's forgotten legacy. It's beautiful, Ruth whispered, her eyes glistening as she watched children playing in the new playground. The sound of their laughter echoed across the courtyard, a stark contrast to the emptiness that had defined the place just months ago. William squeezed his mother's hand. I never understood why Father started this place, he admitted. Now I think I do. It's not just about giving money, it's about giving hope. As they walked through the building, volunteers greeted them warmly. The soup kitchen sparkled with new equipment, and the classroom spaces were filled with bright decorations and learning materials. Each room told a story of renewal and possibility. Clara Johnson approached them, her face radiant with joy. She carried her youngest child on her hip, while her older one clutched a book from the new library. Mr. Moore, Mrs. Collins, she called out, her voice full of emotion. I hardly recognize this place anymore. Ruth smiled warmly at Clara. How are your classes going? She asked, referring to the job training program they'd implemented. I finished my certification last week, Clara beamed. The daycare center here means I can actually attend interviews now. For the first time in years, I feel like I have a real chance. William watched the interaction, struck by how naturally his mother connected with people. There was no pretense, no corporate polish, just genuine care and understanding. The computer lab you set up, Clara continued, turning to William. It's changed everything. My kids can do their homework here, and I'm learning skills I never thought I'd have. She paused, composing herself. You've given us dignity, not just charity. A group of volunteers worked nearby, organizing donations for the food pantry. Ruth noticed William watching them and said softly, "Your father had the right idea, but he forgot the most important part, being present, seeing the real impact." William nodded, remembering the cold efficiency with which his father had managed his charitable giving. "I used to think success was measured in profit margins and market share," he reflected. "But here," he gestured to the bustling activity around them, "here I can see actual lives changing." Clara's older child tugged at William's sleeve, proudly showing him a perfect math test score. William knelt down to the child's level, examining the paper with genuine interest. Ruth watched the interaction, her heart swelling with pride at her son's transformation. "You know," Ruth said as they toured the new medical clinic, "keeping your heart open isn't just about helping others. It's about allowing yourself to receive love too." She touched his arm gently. "Your transformation here? It's just the beginning." William looked around at the lives being touched, the community being rebuilt. He saw volunteers working together, families finding hope, and children discovering new possibilities. In each face, he recognized something of his own journey from isolation to connection. The Foundation's board was skeptical about this level of investment, William admitted. They wanted to focus on more prestigious projects. But being here, seeing this, he watched as Clara helped another mother fill out job applications. "This is what real change looks like." Ruth squeezed his hand, her eyes full of maternal pride. "You've found your way back to your heart," she said softly. "That's the greatest renovation of all." The late afternoon sun painted long shadows across the weathered brick buildings of Ruth's old neighborhood. William Moore parked his luxury car along the curb, looking out of place among the modest surroundings. Ruth Collins sat quietly beside him, her hands clasped tightly in her lap as memories washed over her. "I used to walk these streets every day," Ruth said softly, her eyes taking in the familiar storefronts. Some had changed, but the bones of the neighborhood remained the same. "I'd carry you in that blue blanket your grandmother made. You loved watching the pigeons in the park." William helped Ruth out of the car and they began walking slowly down the sidewalk. Ruth stopped at a small corner store, its faded green awning fluttering in the breeze. "This is where I bought your formula," she said, touching the window gently. "The owner, Mrs. Chen, would always slip an extra candy in my bag for you, even though you were too young for sweets. She said it was for when you grew into them." As they turned the corner, Ruth's steps faltered. There, nestled between a bakery and a bookshop, stood Marshall's photo studio. The original sign hung crooked above the door, its gold lettering barely visible after decades of weather. "I remember this place," Ruth whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "You were just 3 months old. I saved for weeks to have our picture taken together." William placed a steadying hand on her shoulder as they approached the studio. Through the dusty window, they could see that it was still operating, though clearly stuck in time. An elderly man looked up as they entered, the bell above the door announcing their presence. "Can I help you folks?" he asked, adjusting his thick glasses. Ruth stepped forward, her hands trembling slightly. I had a photo taken here about 40 years ago, with my baby boy." She glanced at William, who stood quietly beside her. "I don't suppose you'd have any records from back then?" The old man's face softened with recognition. "You must be thinking of my father's time. He kept everything, bless his heart. Never could bring himself to throw away a single negative." He gestured for them to follow him to a back room. The space was filled with filing cabinets, each labeled meticulously by year. The owner, who introduced himself as Tom Marshall Jr., pulled open a drawer from the early 1980s. "Do you remember the month?" he asked, fingering through the folders. "March," Ruth replied without hesitation. "March 15th. It was a Tuesday." William watched as the man located the folder, handling the old negatives with practiced care. His father pulled out a contact sheet, and Ruth gasped. There, preserved in black and white, was a young Ruth holding a baby William. Her face was radiant with love as she gazed down at her son, who was wrapped in the blue blanket she had mentioned earlier. "That's us," Ruth whispered, tears streaming down her face. "Oh, William, look how tiny you were." William stared at the image, transfixed. He'd never seen a photo of himself this young, and certainly none with his mother. In the picture, Ruth's joy was palpable, untouched by the pain that would soon follow. Tom cleared his throat, clearly moved by the moment. "I can make you a print," he offered. "The negative is in perfect condition." "Please," William said, his own voice unsteady. He wrapped an arm around Ruth's shoulders as she continued to gaze at the contact sheet. "We'd like that very much." As they waited for the print, Ruth shared stories about that day. How William had been fussy until the photographer made silly faces, how proud she'd been to dress him in his best outfit, how she'd dreamed of taking more photos as he grew. The evening light streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of William Moore's penthouse, casting a warm glow across the expansive living room. Ruth Collins sat at the large dining table, surrounded by papers from William's foundation, her reading glasses perched on her nose as she studied the documents with careful attention. "Mrs. Collins," Mia Carter said, gesturing to a proposal, "what do you think about this initiative for homeless shelters?" Ruth adjusted her glasses and smiled warmly. "Please call me Ruth." She picked up the paper and studied it. "You know, when I was on the streets, the thing I missed most wasn't just a bed or food. It was dignity." The foundation staff members leaned in, captivated by her quiet authority. Even William, who had been checking his phone, set it down to listen. "These plans are good," Ruth continued, her voice gentle but firm. "But what if we added spaces where people could learn new skills? Maybe a computer room or a small library. Give them tools to rebuild their lives, not just shelter for the night." William watched his mother with growing admiration. Her simple wisdom, born from hard experience, cut through years of corporate thinking. The staff members were nodding, quickly jotting down notes. "That's brilliant," said James, the foundation's program director. "We could partner with local colleges, maybe set up some basic training courses." Later that evening, as the staff filed out, Mia lingered behind. "Your mother has completely transformed our approach, William," she said, gathering her things. "She sees things we've all missed." William nodded, watching Ruth as she helped the housekeeper clear the conference table. Despite her new life of luxury, she insisted on helping with daily tasks, treating everyone with the same kindness and respect. As evening settled in, William and Ruth sat down to their now routine family dinner. The private chef had prepared Ruth's favorite, pot roast with vegetables, a simple meal that reminded her of happier times. "The foundation team really values your input," William said, cutting into his meat. "Though I noticed you didn't say much about the new healthcare initiative." Ruth chuckled, a warm sound that filled the room. "Oh, I was just thinking about how you used to hate vegetables as a baby. Now look at you, eating Brussels sprouts without complaint." William paused, fork halfway to his mouth. "I did? Goodness, yes. You'd scrunch up your tiny nose and push them away." Ruth demonstrated the face, and suddenly William burst out laughing, a real, genuine laugh that surprised them both. "I still do that sometimes," he admitted, still chuckling. "Just not in public." Ruth's eyes crinkled with joy. "You know, you have your father's laugh. He didn't show it often, but when he did..." She trailed off, then added softly, "It's good to hear it again." William reached across the table and squeezed her hand. These moments of shared memories, even the bittersweet ones, were healing something deep inside him. "Tell me more," he said, settling back in his chair. "What other embarrassing baby stories have you been keeping from me?" As Ruth launched into a tale about his determination to crawl before he could walk, their laughter echoed through the penthouse. The staff in the kitchen exchanged knowing looks. The once cold home had transformed into a place of warmth and life. Mia, returning to collect a forgotten file, paused in the doorway at the sound. Through the dining room entrance, she could see William and Ruth, heads bent close together, sharing stories and smiles. The sight of her usually serious boss wiping tears of laughter from his eyes made her smile. She quietly backed away, leaving mother and son to their precious moment of connection. The renovated family charity site buzzed with excitement as hundreds of community members gathered for its grand reopening. The once dilapidated building now stood proud, its fresh paint gleaming in the morning sun. Banners announcing Moore Foundation Community Center fluttered in the gentle breeze, and volunteers in bright blue shirts guided visitors through the new facilities. William Moore stood at the podium, his usual corporate demeanor softened by genuine emotion. "Today marks not just the reopening of a building," he said, his voice carrying across the crowd, "but the rebirth of my father's dream, a dream that I almost forgot." The audience, seated in rows of white chairs on the freshly laid lawn, listened intently. Ruth Collins sat in the front row, her eyes glistening with pride as she watched her son address the gathering. "But before I say more," William continued, "I'd like to introduce someone who represents exactly why this center exists. Please welcome Clara Johnson." Clara approached the podium, her once worn clothing replaced by a modest but professional outfit. Her hands trembled slightly as she adjusted the microphone. "6 months ago, I was living in my car with my 2 children, she began, her voice wavering. We'd lost everything, and I'd lost hope. She paused, gathering strength. Then I found this place, even before the renovation. Despite its condition, there were people here who cared. They helped me find temporary housing, connected me with job training programs, and most importantly, they gave me back my dignity." Tears flowed freely among the audience as Clara described her journey from homelessness to her current position as a certified nursing assistant. "Today, my kids have a stable home, I have a career I love, and we have a future. That's what this place does. It gives people back their future." When Clara finished, the applause was deafening. William returned to the podium and introduced Ruth, who rose slowly from her seat. She walked to the stage with the quiet grace that had become her trademark, her simple, elegant dress a stark contrast to the clothes she'd worn during her years on the streets. "My story," Ruth began, her voice soft but clear, "is both unique and common. Like many here, I once had nowhere to go." She looked out at the sea of faces, some familiar from her own time on the streets. "I lost everything, my home, my family, and most painfully my baby boy." The audience fell completely silent as Ruth shared her journey, describing nights spent in doorways and days searching through countless neighborhoods for any trace of her son. Her voice broke as she spoke about never giving up hope, even after decades of searching. "But God works in mysterious ways," she said, glancing at William. "The same son I searched for all those years found me, though neither of us knew it at first." She described their first meeting outside his office building, drawing gentle laughter when she mentioned returning his dropped wallet. "Today I stand before you not just as Ruth Collins but as William Moore's mother," she revealed, causing murmurs of amazement from those who hadn't known their story. "And I tell you this because hope is real. Change is possible. This center isn't just about providing services. It's about believing in second chances and never giving up." By now, there wasn't a dry eye in the crowd. William stood beside his mother, placing a supportive hand on her shoulder as she concluded her speech. Even the usually stoic security team could be seen wiping their eyes discreetly. The audience rose in a standing ovation, their applause mixing with sounds of sniffling and emotional exclamations. Volunteers distributed tissues as Ruth stepped down from the podium, immediately enveloped in hugs from community members who had known her during her homeless years. The afternoon sun cast long shadows through the floor-to-ceiling windows of William Moore's office as Mia Carter stepped in, her expression tense. "Mr. Moore, Richard Langston is here to see you. He says it's important." William looked up from his desk, his jaw tightening. Despite Richard's recent downfall after his illegal dealings were exposed, William hadn't expected him to show up here. "Send him in," he said after a moment's consideration. Richard entered, and William was struck by how different he looked. Gone was the sharp, predatory confidence. Instead, Richard's shoulders slumped slightly, his designer suit wrinkled, his face showing signs of sleepless nights. "William," Richard began, his voice lacking its usual smugness. "Thank you for seeing me." "What do you want, Richard?" William's tone was neutral but guarded. Richard sank into one of the leather chairs facing William's desk. "I've been doing a lot of thinking since everything happened." He paused, running a hand through his disheveled hair. "Watching you at that press conference with your mother, seeing how you've changed, it made me realize something." William remained silent, studying his former rival's face for any sign of deception, I've spent my entire career trying to destroy people like you, Richard continued, but seeing how you transformed your pain into something meaningful, it shamed me. His voice cracked slightly. I came to apologize for everything. Mia, who had stayed by the door, raised an eyebrow skeptically, but William noticed something in Richard's eyes, a vulnerability he'd never seen before. What exactly are you hoping to achieve here, Richard? William asked carefully. Nothing. I don't expect forgiveness or trust. Richard straightened in his chair. I want to do better. Be better. Your story with your mother, the work you're doing with the foundation, it's made me question everything I thought was important. William leaned back, considering Richard's words. Years of business instinct told him to be wary, but his recent experiences with Ruth had taught him about the power of second chances. If you're serious about change, William said slowly, prove it. He opened his desk drawer and pulled out a folder. The foundation is launching new programs for homeless families. We need supporters who are willing to contribute anonymously. No recognition, no tax benefits, no publicity. Richard's eyes widened slightly as William slid the folder across the desk. You'd trust me with this? Trust is earned, William replied. This is an opportunity to start earning it. Richard picked up the folder with trembling hands, nodding slowly. Thank you, I won't disappoint you. As Richard stood to leave, William added, Remember, Richard, this isn't about me or you. It's about the people we can help. I understand, Richard said quietly. More than ever before. After Richard left, Mia approached William's desk. Are you sure about this? William smiled slightly, thinking of his mother and her belief in second chances. Everyone deserves an opportunity to change, Mia. Sometimes they just need someone to believe it's possible. The evening light filtered softly through the penthouse windows as Ruth Collins sat beside William Moore on the plush living room sofa. Her weathered hands trembled slightly as she reached for the chain around her neck. There's something I've been wanting to show you, she said, her voice gentle. William watched as she carefully unclasped the locket she always wore. I remember seeing you touch this so often, William said quietly. Even that first night when you stayed here. Ruth smiled, tears gathering in her eyes. Your father gave this to me the day we found out I was pregnant with you. She held the small golden heart in her palm. He said it was to remind me that love doesn't need grand gestures or fancy words. It just needs to be true. William's breath caught as Ruth opened the locket, revealing a tiny photograph of herself, much younger, holding a baby. Is that... Yes, that's us. Ruth's voice wavered. Your father took this picture. He wasn't always the cold man you knew. Before his family intervened, he was different, gentle, loving. William touched the photograph with trembling fingers. I never knew. He gave me this locket to symbolize unconditional love, Ruth explained, wiping away a tear. Even when I was forced to leave, I kept it close. It was my connection to you, my way of keeping you in my heart. William took the locket carefully, studying it in the fading light. All these years you wore this, thinking of me. Every single day, Ruth whispered. And now, I want you to have it. William looked up sharply. Mom, no, it's yours. Ruth shook her head, closing his fingers around the locket. It's meant to be passed on. Let it remind you of our journey, not just the pain, but the miracle of finding each other again. William stared at the locket in his palm, feeling its weight, not just physical, but emotional. I promise to keep it safe, he said softly, as a reminder of everything we've overcome, everything we are to each other now. Ruth reached out and squeezed his hand. Who would have thought that night when I picked up your wallet that we'd end up here? Sometimes the best gifts come in unexpected ways, William replied, his voice thick with emotion. Thank you for never giving up on finding me. They sat together in comfortable silence, the locket between them, a small golden symbol of their extraordinary journey from strangers to mother and son, from loss to reunion, from pain to healing. The afternoon sun cast dappled shadows through the trees as William and Ruth strolled along the winding park path. The gentle breeze carried the sweet scent of blooming flowers, and children's laughter echoed from a nearby playground. "Remember when you first asked me about the charity site?" Ruth asked, her eyes twinkling. "You were so skeptical back then." William chuckled, adjusting his casual weekend sweater. "I was skeptical about everything. It's hard to believe how much has changed in such a short time." They paused near a wooden bench overlooking a small pond. Ruth watched a family of ducks glide across the water, while William pulled out his tablet. "I've been working on something," he said, showing her architectural drawings. "We're planning to expand the foundation, not just in the city but across the state. Each location will have housing assistance, job training, and counseling services." Ruth's eyes widened as she studied the plans. "Just like what I needed all those years ago." "Exactly," William replied softly. "Your story, our story, it opened my eyes to what people really need. Not just handouts, but real support and dignity." They continued walking, their steps falling into an easy rhythm. Ruth squeezed William's arm gently. "You've become more than I ever dreamed possible. Not just successful, but compassionate, understanding." William stopped at a flowering cherry tree, its pink petals dancing in the breeze. "I learned it from you, Mom. Your strength, your persistence, your kindness, even when life was cruel. It's changing lives now." Ruth reached into her small purse and pulled out the old photograph of herself holding baby William. The edges were worn, but the image remained clear, a young mother gazing adoringly at her infant son. "Destiny never forgets," she whispered, holding William's hand as they walked toward the setting sun. Their figures cast long shadows across the path as they continued their leisurely stroll, their shared laughter mixing with the peaceful sounds of the park around them. If you enjoyed the story of William and Ruth, I handpicked this next story that will touch your heart. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.